My name is Ellen Graham, and I'm a fourth-year politics student here at the University of Virginia. I am also an intern at the Center for Politics, or have been in the past. And I want to begin now, if you guys can kind of gather back around, introducing our next moderator for our panel, Patricia Solis Doyle. As a campaign manager for Hillary Clinton for president, Patricia Solis Doyle was the first Hispanic woman to lead a presidential effort in the United States. In a business where it is rare for women to lead major campaigns and where minorities in key positions are even harder to find. Ms. Solis Doyle is recognized as an effective and low-profile leader with exceptional organizational and political abilities. The Washington Post described her as a first among equals in Clinton's inner circle, and someone who has the potential gift to smell danger long before it is encountered. Prior to establishing HillPAC, Solis Doyle served in the White House as an assistant to the president and as director of scheduling and advance for the First Lady. In this capacity, she worked to promote Clinton administration policies on children, healthcare, and women's issues, and to assist with political support for the Democratic candidates nationwide. She also managed the execution of Senator Clinton's overseas travel, selecting and coordinating events to further the U.S. diplomatic and foreign policy goals. Ms. Solis Doyle has been honored by Hispanic Magazine with the 2007 Latinas of Excellence Award and for her accomplishments in the area of government, politics, and civil leadership. She also received Siempre Mujer magazine's Siempre Inspiration Award, honoring remarkable Latinas whose achievements and contributions to their communities are helping shape the future of Hispanic women in this country. Hispanic Business Magazine recently counted her among America's 100 most influential Hispanics. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Patricia Solis Doyle to the stage.
Thank you very much. It is a real honor to be at this very notable yearly conference. It's my first time doing it, so I'm excited and a little nervous. But our panel is called Politics and Policy. The election is over, and I'm sure many of you think, thank goodness. And the winners have taken their victory lap, and the losers are dissecting what went wrong and trying to get it fixed before the next big election. And we just celebrated Thanksgiving, and everyone took some time off. Congress, the president, had turkey, they saw Lincoln, and they got some rest. But now we're back, and we're moving from campaigning to governing, which are two very different things. And I would say, and I would think my panelists would agree, is governing is much more difficult than campaigning because you actually have to work with people that you just fought against and with people you ultimately disagree with. So I'm excited to talk about what happens next and the issues that are upon us. And before we start, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel. Let's start with Jamelle Bouie, who is a staff writer at the American Prospect, whose work has appeared in the Washington Independent, CNN, and the Washington Post. Next up is Bob Costa, or Robert Costa, not to be confused with Bob Costa, but we call him Bob. He is a political reporter for National Review, and most recently, Politico named him one of the top 10 most notable journalists of the 2012 campaign. And we have Kiki McLean, who is my friend, who I have had the pleasure of working with on some campaigns together and in the White House with her. She serves as a senior partner, and she's the public head of Global Public Affairs and is the managing director of the Washington office for Porter Novelli. And she's a fantastic Democratic operative. Ed Rollins, unfortunately, was going to be here, but he has the flu and will not be able to make it. And Joe Trippi, we don't know where he is. We think he's coming. And when he gets here, we will... He could be lost on the grounds. So, let's get started. Obviously, in my humble opinion, the best political operatives, the best elected officials, in my mind, know how to intersect politics and policy, because it's definitely about the ideas, but it's also about being able to get the ideas done. And so, as the theme of our panel, I want to get started with what's ahead of us. And obviously, the first thing that's ahead of us is the fiscal cliff. On December 31st, there'll be $500 billion in tax cuts and spending cuts that will go into effect unless Congress and the White House can come up with a deal. And so that's the first question I want to pose our panel. And I do want to get into the details of the deal, if there is a deal. But my first question is, given the somewhat negativity of our past election 3 weeks ago, given the scars and the fact that we were all a little traumatized by the debt ceiling debate last year, given that it's already starting with Boehner saying that he'll use raising the debt ceiling this year as leverage for a deal. Jay Carney said, that negotiating over a drink or in a social atmosphere is overrated. So there's already some negativity going on. Given all of that, do you guys think we can actually get a deal in the next 34 days? We have 34 days for people to come together, work together. Given everything that's been going on, do you think we can actually get a deal? Kiki.
Yes. Well, you probably want me to tell you why.
Okay, yeah,
okay.
I do.
Yeah, I think we can get a deal, and here's why. It's not guaranteed. I tell you, it's a little bit better than 50-50 right now, and it's because of this. One of the things that I saw in a lot of the research that I was participating in through the election cycle last year is people want a deal. It's that simple. The elected officials, consumers want a deal. In 2010, Tea Party led and supported candidates went across the country because people said, we don't want a deal. We don't want you cutting a deal with that guy. We don't want the president to get away with anything. We want you to hold the line. And all of a sudden, holding the line did nothing for no one. No more jobs. Job creation wasn't going fast enough. We're not pulling out of the recession in a strong enough fashion. And voters this time recognized, and the elected officials who had to go home and run in tight races recognized they had nothing to run on. They have to have a deal. They also all acutely feel the pain of the ridiculousness with which they manage the debt ceiling argument. So there's some posturing out there right now. They're the people who are saying, well, we should just let it go off the cliff, and then that'll force everybody, it'll force everybody to good behavior. It's kind of like aversion therapy and drug addiction or tobacco cessation programs. Just smoke it till you just can't smoke them anymore, and then you'll quit, and we know that's not true. So what you're finding now is a group of people who recognize when you go out and you talk about going off the fiscal cliff, or you talk about holding the debt ceiling hostage, they are weak positions and they are tactics. And the American electorate's patience for tactics at this point is low. So I actually think, I'll tell you another secret, and I'll probably get in trouble somewhere, and I know there are media in the room, for saying this. I just think Eric Cantor's not at the table, and he doesn't play as big a role. And as a result, I think that gives Boehner the room to be the speaker he probably has matured to be and wanted to be his whole life. It doesn't mean he won't make mistakes, and there won't be tough moments in the next 34 days. And I believe that President Obama has more clearly recognized what his role is in this effort this time. That's why I believe it's a possibility. Like I said, it's slightly better than 50-50, but I think it's doable.
Well, 50-50 is pretty good at this point. Bob, you covered Mitt Romney. You were on that side of the campaign coverage. What do you think? I mean, you saw how negative it got there towards the end. Do you think that, Democrats in the Congress, Republicans in the Congress and the White House can come together and come up with a deal in the next 34 days?
It's a great question. I just came here from Capitol Hill. And when you talk about what's happening in Congress, it's really a multi-tiered chessboard. And when you ask about what a deal is, well, there are many kinds of deals happening right now. For instance, we have a deadline right now for the fiscal cliff. on one chessboard, there's all these negotiations about trying to just maybe extend the rates or come up with a deal to solve the fiscal cliff problem. And then there's a broader discussion about what Boehner was trying to do last time around the debt ceiling, a grand bargain deal. And that's when you hear about the battles with Grover Norquist and people reneging on the pledge. That's about trying to get a broader deal to address the debt problem. I think what the Congress is going to do, from what I hear from Capitol Hill insiders, is that they're going to have a short-term deal, and they're going to do what they always do in Congress, which is make a deal to make another deal in the future. That's what's going to happen. I don't think in 34 days, you're not going to have a grand bargain like Boehner and Obama envisioned in 2011. But I think we talked about the negativity coming off of the election. I think one of the most important speeches to watch was Boehner's first speech right after the election. He came out and said explicitly he's open to revenue. And that caused a ruckus within the Republicans on Capitol Hill because for so long they've been against any kind of revenue. The real question right now for Republicans is this. Grover Norquist, who's an anti-tax activist in Washington, D.C., established a pledge 2 decades ago that says if you sign this pledge, you're against all kinds of tax increases. But now you're seeing increasingly that Republicans, such as Saxby Chambliss, senator from Georgia, Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, Tom Cole, another congressman, they're open to the idea that through large-scale tax reform and by eliminating tax loopholes, deductions, that you would enable the federal government to get more revenue, but you wouldn't increase rates. That seems to be the post-election consensus among Republicans, that Obama won, you have to give him something. They don't want to cave on rates in the Republican Party, but they're willing to talk about tax reform. So I expect tax reform, should a short-term deal happen on the fiscal cliff, to be the real story of 2013.
Okay. Jamelle, I want to ask the same question, but I want to ask it in a different way. I think that the president and the White House has been very clear that they are not going to give on tax rates. They want the tax cuts for the middle class to continue on, but they want, that top 2% wealthy to pay higher tax rates. However, don't you have to give a little to get something? And doesn't that mean that he's going to have to give on entitlements? But if he gives on entitlements, what happens to that fantastic coalition of demographics that got him elected? What do they do? Hispanics, blacks, young women, young people. Does he lose them? Does he slap them by doing that?
That's also an excellent question. So here's the thing. Here's what I think is interesting about the fiscal cliff situation. That wasn't the case last year with the debt ceiling. With the debt ceiling, Obama needed the debt ceiling to be raised, and Republicans simply weren't. They were willing to let us reach the debt ceiling, not pay our obligations, which gave them a tremendous amount of tactical leverage in that situation. This time, what we know will happen, regardless of anything, if nothing happens, tax rates are going to go up to where they were during the Clinton era, which means, in effect, that whether or not they do depends not entirely, but largely on whether Obama wants a deal this year or if he's willing to wait until January, which gives him the leverage in the situation. So I think that's the question we have to figure out if we're trying to figure out what Obama will or is willing to concede. Because if he says to himself, we will go over the cliff, the tax rates will go up, but the spending cuts will take time to phase in. There won't be any immediate damage to the economy. We actually have a little space to continue negotiating after December 31st. Then I'll let us go over, and then all of a sudden the status quo is no longer trying to preserve the Bush tax cuts. It's trying to lower taxes. And that puts Republicans in a more difficult position. I think that if I were a Republican who wanted to make some sort of deal and I wanted to get more revenue but not go violate the pledge, I would actually prefer this situation because you can say that you're not raising taxes. You haven't voted to raise taxes if we go over the cliff. You've simply voted to cut taxes in they're above a level where they were before, which is like a nice out if you're trying to save face. If Obama and the Democrats do decide to go further with entitlement reform, I think, as kind of a quick bracket, I think Obama doesn't get enough credit for the entitlement reform that has already happened. The Affordable Care Act implements policies that, if they're successful, could potentially rein in the cost of Medicare over the long term or the medium term. But if they decide to do more, retirement age increases with Medicare, benefit reductions with Social Security, I'm not sure that you'd see necessarily a disintegration or tension within the demographic coalition that Team Obama assembled for 2012. But I do think you'd see a lot of anger from liberals who I think rightfully will say, listen, we set aside our misgivings to support you full-throatedly, and then you win and knife us in the back for no particular reason. And so that's where I think you'll see the tension, and perhaps like a genuine sort of rebellion against the administration. I mean, remember, before re-election, the liberals were hesitant about like more full-throated criticism because, listen, if he lost, then there goes all of their priorities. But he's in office for 4 more years. He'll obviously play a part in who the next Democratic nominee is, and so this is the time now, I think, for liberals to begin putting pressure if they want to have sort of an effect on what happens over the next couple of years.
Yeah, Kiki, you want to respond?
I think it's important that there are a couple. Oh, look who's here.
Oh, well, look who's here.
Come on up. There are a couple of things that I think are important to remember that the elected officials certainly know, and that the policy geeks certainly know as you watch the negotiations go on first. First of all, the concept of falling off the cliff on December 31st has outcomes that no one in this room, regardless of their party, should wish for, okay? Republicans and Democratic elected officials look up and say, well, then we buy ourselves 3 more months, 4 more months, whatever it may be to negotiate a deal. Here's the good news. I'm blessed. I can survive in that economy. There are millions of Americans who cannot survive in that economy. To have those cuts go immediately into effect, to have what kind of groceries they can buy in the first quarter of this year go into effect, those are the people who get hurt in the delay, not kind of accidentally. The checks stop. The money stops immediately. There are millions of Americans affected by that. The second is this idea that Bob raised, which is around the concept of the rate versus the revenue. That's ultimately going to be the debate here, the rates versus the revenue. And sitting on the campus of this institution, you have to be realistic about what that debate is about. Mm-hmm. You look up and Republicans will say, we're going to give you revenue, but you'll never change the rates. You are therefore locking the country for presidencies and administrations and governments and needs that we don't even understand generations now from, that you'll never be able to walk back, because politically, to Jamal's point, that won't happen. The other thing is when you look at revenue and everybody says, well, we'll just close all those loopholes, okay? When you close all those loopholes, first of all, it's not enough, okay? You can get to, I don't know, monopoly money, $500-600 million, I think is the latest estimate. But here's what happens. You can close that charitable philanthropic loophole, so the rich people who give millions of dollars away. What happens to an institution like U.Va the day that happens? How many custodians here are no longer at work? How many research scientists here are no longer at work? How is our society affected by the lack of that research and academic pursuit coming out of here? That's just one institution, and I think if it were only this institution, it would be significant. So it's really important to understand what those immediate outcomes are in both the concept of going over the cliff. It's short term. In a political world, it's not painful, but there are many households for whom it will be immediately painful and potentially unrecoverable. And secondly, in the rate versus revenue debate, the impact is not just where the numbers are, but where they won't be following that kind of agreement. So I just want to make sure that people understand those two elements of the debate as it moves forward.
Okay. We're going to let Joe Trippi talk. So Joe, let me just first introduce you. Joe is here. We're very happy that he's here. He is Democratic political operative who's worked on the presidential campaigns of Ted Kennedy, Walter Mondale, Gary Hart, and Howard Dean, among others. He's worked on numerous Senate gubernatorial and mayoral races. He and I have never worked together, but came close once, I think. And Joe, we're talking about the fiscal cliff, which is upon us in 34 days. And the general question, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, is given the climate, where we had a pretty negative campaign, where we have, liberals and conservatives sort of holding the line, where we have a president, frankly, who doesn't really have to concern himself about running for election ever again and can focus more on legacy and doing big things. Can these three entities, Democrats on the Hill, Republicans on the Hill, and the White House, come up with a deal in the next 34 days?
Yeah, they will.
Yes. We agreed. That was good.
Yeah, they'll do that. And my guess is both the right and the left will be upset with whatever comes out of it. I agree with everything I heard so far from Kiki. That the consequences are too grave. I mean, the other thing is, look, there really is no fiscal cliff. There's no such thing as the fiscal cliff. The country's not going to fall out of bed the next day and not be able to get up. But any failure to do something, the markets, it'll be the same thing that happened the last time with TARP and stimulus, where every time Congress failed to do anything, there was a 700-point drop, and all of a sudden the next day they all woke up and said we need to do something. So there'll be. I'm not saying that there won't be some spasm of some sort, but my own guess is that look, what we just got through was an election period where Democrats scored by saying they just want to help the rich, and the other guys scored by saying they just want to spend and tax you. And neither one of them was in the middle of that going to say, no, the other guy doesn't really. Well, we can come halfway. We can meet somewhere. There was no political gain for either side to do that. Now the political fallout of failure will be a massive loss for either one of the parties or all incumbents in 2010. Nothing so concentrates the mind of a politician like political death. So they will figure it out, even if some of them do pay a penalty for it. But it'll get figured out, I think, and it'll be a combination of revenue and cuts. And the problem will be, I think Kiki's right about the rates versus closing loopholes argument. There are sound reasons for each side of that. One of them, though, the failure, leaving rates sort of permanently where they are is a much bigger long-term problem for the reasons Kiki's talked about. You can't. That's pretending that you can somehow see the future, and not a very wise way to go. But who knows? Maybe the president will cave on that. I don't know what the deal will look like.
Okay, thanks. Let's shift, just to still stay on the fiscal cliff, but just shift focus a little bit, and let's talk about tactics. I started this panel by saying that the campaign is over, and aren't we so happy about that? But is it really? I mean, today's news coverage is really covering the president's roadshow to sell the tax rates, and he's meeting with, average middle-class Americans at the White House. He's bringing in CEOs. He's bringing small business leaders. Republican leadership is also going to go out on the road. Is this a smart way to tackle this? Is it just, a show? What do you think, Jamelle?
I think it's a smart way to tackle this. I really push against the idea that there's some sort of division between politics and governing. There isn't. Doing politics, going on the road, hamming it up for crowds is just as much a part of governing as sitting in back rooms and making deals. And I think that one of the failures of Obama's first term was that he was not committed enough to that part of governing, the political part of governing, that I don't think something like the Affordable Care Act would have ever been popular, but maybe you wouldn't have seen the huge backlash had Obama actually made a real effort to sell the legislation to the public. So I think right now, going to ordinary people, doing rallies on raising tax rates is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to keep things in the public eye. Because frankly, Obama just has a platform that none of his opponents do, and he should put that to use. That's not to say that putting it to use will cause his opponents to bend, not at all. And in fact, it may heighten their opposition. But at the very least, he can let the public know where he stands and maybe encourage voters to put pressure on their representatives. So I think this is exactly the right thing he should be doing. I wish he would talk more about, I wish he would talk a little less about tax rates and maybe more about the fact that in addition to all the cuts that are happening, that we're losing the payroll tax cuts and we're losing an unemployment insurance extension on January 1st, and those things would be far more detrimental to the economy than an increase in tax rates, at least in the short term. So that would be my only complaint. Talk more about that stuff and not so much about raising taxes on rich people, which, if that's your thing, that's your thing.
Okay. Bob, as the other journalist on the panel, what do you think? Is this a smart way to go? Or
I respectfully disagree with Jamelle. The president just won re-election, and now he's going on a victory lap tour to promote his ideas on the fiscal cliff. And I can disagree all I want. Conservatives and Republicans don't like this. They think it's showboating. It's not getting any work done. But the most interesting thing to me as a reporter on Capitol Hill is that Democrats on Capitol Hill don't think the president engages enough with congressional leaders. In Bob Woodward's book, The Price of Politics, he writes constantly about how the president just is aloof from both his own party and Republicans, does not engage on health care. He was not involved in the messy details of legislating. Ronald Reagan used to have Tip O'Neill to the White House. You never hear stories about Obama having a social relationship with congressional leaders. He played golf with John Boehner once or twice. But I think one of Obama's failings as president, he's done a lot right on the politics side, but on legislating, he's not really involved. He's detached. And sometimes this is to his benefit because he can play against Capitol Hill. He's not one of them. But to really be a legislative leader, I think right after winning a second term, to go on the road instead of going to Capitol Hill and huddling says something about Obama's politics, but it also says something about the state of politics in this country. Politicians themselves are just almost averse to having real discussions on Capitol Hill like they used to just a few decades ago.
Yeah, let's let Kiki respond.
So I disagree a little bit with what Jamelle said. I do think there's a difference between governing and campaigning, but I do think in the governing role you have to lead, and you have to lead the conversation. And so for the president to go to a toy factory to talk about the impact that this is going to have economically on somebody who owns a business, particularly at Christmas time, when that's when they're going to get the bulk of their revenue and their product is moved out, and it's about American-made products, that's a legitimate point to talk about how policy is affecting real Americans and in particular American business. So if that's campaigning, so be it. What I would say is that the American electorate's not going to tolerate huge bus tours every day on every issue. But there are moments you have to do that. And I think you're right. I think he is different than a Lyndon Johnson, I would say, as a Texan, and even different than the president that Patty and I worked for, and Bill Clinton, who was a former governor, who was really used to working with a state legislature to bring things to fruition on a daily basis. But he governs in a modern era where there are different ways for Americans to have a voice. Technology, social media, and the kind of engagement that he led in his 2008 campaign has given a different way of doing that. I think he's probably learned some lessons, to your point, and I think you probably already see more conversation going. It's reported today that Governor Romney is headed to the White House for a sit-down meeting with him. He's clearly looking not only to somebody who led 57 million people to vote for him, but somebody who will probably have a voice with some Republican leaders as well. So it's clear he's looking for ambassadors.
I think we're in a different age, and I think the first mistake, and I don't mean to speak ill of Rahm Emanuel, but I think one of the mistakes the president, although lots of people like to do that, but one of the mistakes was thinking that what I need is a chief of staff who can break the arms in the back room and bend arms on Capitol Hill for me, and I can do it too. And the president disengaged from having to do that because he had Rahm, but he didn't engage the people, and I think that's a lesson that they've learned, and so my 2K is a much faster and better way. These guys that have the American people breaking these guys' arms is a lot better than Rahm Emanuel doing it. And so for the president to go out there and call on them to make sure their members know where the people are on this. If you didn't get the message in the election, I hope you'll get it from these people saying doing my 2K and other things.
You want to explain, Joe, what my 2K is? Because I think it just launched today.
My 2K is a Twitter handle, a Twitter hashtag If you support the president, you hashtag My2K across the Twitter network. This is, by the way, a problem that the Republicans have had throughout the campaign, is the president's campaign was able to spread messages peer-to-peer, citizen to citizen, in a way that the Romney campaign was woefully behind. You're now in an age where people can engage, they can go to these events, they can make their voices heard, and they can spread this message of support for the president's proposal to millions of other people, and it can ripple throughout the online network. The problem is, what's the antidote for that if you haven't built one as a party or as a governing entity, as the Republicans have failed to do? And what's the other handle? Is it My 1 Million?
My 2K, just so you know, refers to the concept that if the middle class tax cuts expire, the average cost to a family is $2,200. So that's
right.
The My 2K.
So I'm sure the billionaires can tweet My 2 million out, because that's what their hit would be. If their tax cut doesn't. I mean, it doesn't work. The messaging doesn't work. Nothing about it works. We're in a different era. People do not get all their information from television. They get it from each other. Mm-hmm. And if 4 people email you or text you that the new hot movie sucks, okay, it no longer matters how many millions of dollars the studio spends telling you it'll be the greatest movie you ever saw. You're not going. What Barack Obama is doing as president is letting the people be the messenger. They're his chief of staff. And I think that's really important. It's an important step that's happening. And I think that they missed that in the first days of the first term, but I think hopefully they're getting that now in a very powerful way.
Yeah, Jamelle, go ahead.
I just wanted to sort of like gently push against the idea that better social relationships with congressional leaders plays a significant part in getting things done. A really great political scientist at George Washington University, John Sides, recently did a quick overview of sort of the literature on this, and the conclusion is that the benefit of better social relationships is marginal. Doesn't mean it doesn't matter, and in a tight situation it can be very helpful. But what's more important to a legislative outcome is simply the structure of the Congress at the time and the and who's controlling both houses of Congress. And so, I'm not sure that in the last 4 years, in the last Congress, for example, that if Obama had met with Republican leaders more often, he would have had a better go of things. Nothing about that changes the incentives that different leaders and different lawmakers have. And so I don't see any real meaningful gain you get from that. But I can perceive a meaningful gain you get from going out to the public and stating your case and letting them know where you stand.
I actually think there's value in the personal relationships for a number of reasons. Number one, anytime you're going to negotiate with somebody, you want to know everything about them.
Right.
You want to know what their passions are. You want to know what their weak spots are. You want to know what's valuable to them. That's true in a marriage. That's true in a business relationship, and that's true in politics. And so, and it also takes away the ability to throw personal arrows that then make the gulf that much wider every time. So I'm not saying that we would get past the fiscal cliff if Barack Obama went and played golf and faked it, because faking it doesn't do it. But the more interaction over time, the more knowledge he has and they have of him, it works to both parties' advantage. It doesn't mean you have to fake it and have dinner parties, to your point, Jamelle. You don't have to pretend that. But the interaction's important, and I think that matters.
I'd agree with that, but there's a problem, and that is the problem is I don't really think it's the relationship between Barack Obama and Boehner.
No.
It's Boehner and the rest of his caucus.
Yeah.
If there isn't a deal, it won't be because the president and Boehner couldn't reasonably sit down and make one.
Because they had one last
spring.
They had one.
The problem is Boehner then cuts the deal, goes back to his caucus, and the members of the Tea Party, freshmen, say over our dead bodies, and by the way, that means your dead body because you won't be speaker if we do this. And all of a sudden, the deal unravels. So the problem is you could invest all that time into having those personal relationships, understanding the leadership on both sides and working with them. The problem is right now you can't deliver the Republican caucus on any, or at least so far in the first term.
No, I think there's a better chance on this time.
On this time. But that I think had a lot more. It wasn't so much the personal relationships. I agree they could have been better. But I think in the end that wasn't the personal relationship that didn't exist. It was unlike when the Republicans took power under Newt Gingrich, who led the revolution at that point. Those freshmen, those members believed, here's our leader of the revolution. So when he cut a deal with Clinton and he walked back into the caucus and said, hey guys, we're going to do this, he was the leader of the revolution. Okay, well, if he says we need, this is our leader, we should do it. He had that relationship. Boehner does not have that relationship with the Tea Party members of his caucus. They came in, they want to throw him and everybody like him out, and just sort of living with him because they have to, because they didn't quite have enough power, and the deal got cut. So I think that's the real conundrum on solving a lot of the problems. How does that caucus come together? What did it learn any lessons? I'm talking about the entire Republican caucus. Did it learn any lessons from this election, or does it want to continue to push in the direction it wants to push through the 2010 election? If that's the case, there could be a failure here, and they could be destroyed in 2010 because I think they'll be seen as the people that caused the deal to go down. So for the mess to happen. It doesn't have to be that way. I don't think it's going to be that way. But if it goes down, that's going to be, I think, the main reason for it.
Okay. I think that's actually a nice segue into the next issue that I want to talk about. But I just want to make clear that every member of our panel does believe there's going to be a deal by December 31st. So that's pretty good. I want to talk next about immigration reform. I think that the president has made it pretty clear, both publicly and privately, that he intends to tackle some sort of comprehensive immigration reform soon after the fiscal cliff and early in 2013. Our keynote speaker, I was joking with earlier, George P. Bush, that given the election results, it is very cool to be Hispanic these days. It was always cool, but now it's really cool. We are the cool, sexy demographic these days. So here's what happened. Obviously, the 2012 election highlighted the Latino voting power. Mitt Romney got 27% of the Latino vote, which, some analysts say is one of the reasons he lost. And, you can argue that a lot of it was because of the rhetoric that Republicans used, that Mitt Romney used when it came to immigration. The support of the Arizona bill, this idea of self-deportation. But it's a conundrum for Republicans going forward, isn't it? Because they are, against amnesty. So how do they open up the dialogue on immigration reform without actually going against their principles? And I want to start with Bob.
It's a great question. The first thing that happened after the elections, Republicans got together on Capitol Hill and they said, demographics, this is a total disaster. We have to find a way to appeal to Hispanic voters. And so you already see this week, John Kyle, senator from Arizona, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, senator from Texas, they're coming together on a dream-like bill. A DREAM Act is the bill Obama had an executive order on earlier in the year. And what the Republicans are trying to do is not go towards amnesty fully, but they want to move towards it, at least for students and children who are living here, who are the sons and daughters of illegal immigrants. That, to them, feels like the balance that they can go to. In 2007, the immigration reform discussions collapsed. Republicans really fear now that if they continue just to espouse self-deportation in an awkward manner, if they just talk about border security, they're going to be missing out on a key voter block, as Hillary mentioned. And so they're going to start doing different things. Watch for instance, Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, potential presidential contender. Before Obama came out with his executive order, Rubio himself was hatching his own similar DREAM Act type plan. Obama was smart. He got in front of Rubio before Rubio unveiled his legislation. Obama got credit for it. Republicans have really been stumbling since. They're going to try to probably elevate Rubio to be a spokesman on immigration. You'll see the border senators like Kyle and Hutchison come out and have their own similar type plans. But I think it's going to be a question of tone. Can Republicans talk about illegal immigration in a way that doesn't sound like they're alienating people who have Hispanic backgrounds? That is the key. More than the policy, it's the approach.
Kiki?
What's really interesting is it's been Republicans who actually led the effort earlier on. I'm going to give some credit to President Bush, too, as a governor of Texas, understanding the needs for this issue and recognizing that there are two sides to immigration, right, of the same coin, and they're not opposing sides. They're the flip sides of what you have the concerns, the very grassroots concerns of those people who are here as undocumented workers. And you also have the concerns of big business and big immigrant. When you talk about immigration reform, this is not just about migrant workers in the California fields and at the Texas border, right? This is about HB1 visas and Microsoft getting the talent that they need. This is the ability to hold talent that comes from around the globe here to become educated, and then we don't keep them. They leave because they can't get the visa to stay. So one of the things you have to remember is that you've got two ways you can approach this. You can approach this in its macro form, comprehensive immigration reform, or you can take a more piecemeal approach. And when I say piecemeal, I don't mean that to have a negative connotation. If you look at what Bill Clinton did when he failed on comprehensive health care reform, he proceeded over his 2 terms to take small pieces, children's health insurance, right? Then cherry picking. You saw small pieces of reform go about it. I think based on a meeting I was in recently, I think there is an appetite for a pieces approach in the Republican Party, that the thought of comprehensive reform becomes really unappetizing because it's harder for them to build the coalition as they go. By the same token, for Democrats, because of the base that we have in the Hispanic community, Democrats say we can't have anything but comprehensive reform. This is, however, the one issue that I believe we have the best chance as a nation for having a solution to within the next 2 years. I really believe that both sides want this and that it's in both sides' interest to solve it. This is not a case of one side doesn't want it and the other does. It's also really important to understand the slight difference, and I too was fascinated to watch George P. Bush's data that he shared with us today at lunch during his keynote. It's really important to remember politically what the George W. Bush campaign did to Democrats, and the Kerry campaign in particular in 2004. And it was this. He actually didn't win the Hispanic vote, but by dealing with an ex-urban structure in his Get Out the Vote campaign, he only needed to peel a certain amount away from Democrats. So what we as Democrats like to say, he stole 4% from us, right? And that's how he beat us. It wasn't that we have to actually develop a long-term agenda and policy and vision for the future that is attractive to Hispanic American voters. We just have to make sure that we get enough off of them. And I think for Democrats, when you walk up and you look at the evangelical numbers and the movement from devout Catholics into the mystical, and I grew up a Catholic in San Antonio, Texas, okay, and you see the movement to the mystical and the evangelical, right there is a political landscape that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, right, I agree. I want to ask the same question just in a little bit of a different way. So Democrats, the president, the White House, they are really searching for, in whatever reform they go after, a path to citizenship for those 11 million illegal immigrants that are living here, productively.
Yeah.
But one could argue, as a tactical politician, that those 11 million potential new citizens will become 11 million potential new voters, right, who will, in all likelihood, lean Democratic. So how does the Republican Party sort of, as Bob said, fix the tone, but really reach out in a substantive ways to those ever-growing demographic. Joe, do you want to, or can they?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons you'll see a fight to the death among, again, getting back to the caucus problem. There will be a lot of Republicans who will fight any kind of amnesty because exactly the reason you're talking about. It means, at least with current demographic trends and how those trends are voting, it would mean that the party doesn't win an election for a long time. But they have to, there's two things. First of all, they have to decide as a party whether they're going to follow the California model or the Texas model. The California model, California was you want to see the future of the Republican Party, California was a Republican-leaning swing state. Nixon, Reagan, pretty much occasionally voted Democratic, but was fundamentally a leaning red state until a guy named Pete Wilson became governor of California and started to become a real hawk on immigration and tried to pass tough immigration laws and pushed the Hispanic community completely out of the Republican Party there. And once that happened, it's now on very rare occasions a statewide candidate can win a Republican can win an election in California. Both senators have been Democratic. Governor Jerry Brown comes back. I don't remember the last time California voted for a Republican for president.
Clinton flipped in 96.
Yeah, it's flipped in 96, and it hasn't gone back, and no sign of doing so. Texas, Bush, understanding of, I think that that we can broaden our reach into that community. I'm talking as a Republican now. Broaden our reach 4 or 5 points. Really actively work. And here's the grounds. They are socially conservative, very religious. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons and value reasons inside the GOP that would be should be a welcome at to many Hispanics, not all, but enough that they could become very competitive. The problem is they're hung up on this other problem, both the demographic problem and the immigration problem. And I think if they pursue the Pete Wilson model, which they have been doing, I mean nationally, if they continue to pursue that, they will be looking at exactly the same outcome nationally that they have set for themselves in California. Doesn't mean they won't win elections. They do win them out there. I'm just saying, but it makes them very, very, very tough for them to be competitive.
So, Jamelle, given the president's commitment to try and get this done, and the Democrats' commitment, but everything the panel said, can it get done with the Republican Party or no?
I think the piecemeal approach may end up working best for the Republican Party, in part because I think they're sort of they're pressed by two competing pressures. The first is that Latinos are, separate and apart from immigration, just more liberal than, I guess, the average American. They're more likely to support government intervention in the economy. They're more likely to support government, greater government assistance to education programs. Like, they're just on every issue, Latinos are just more liberal than most Americans. And so I have no doubt that Republicans will do a better job of talking about Latinos and immigration in ways that aren't alienating, in ways that sort of respect the common humanity of us all. But that's just not enough. On a core level, the Republican Party platform isn't necessarily responsive to the interests of Latinos. So that's the first pressure. The second pressure is that the core members of the Republican base, working class whites, middle class, sort of like lower middle class whites in states like Pennsylvania, in states like Ohio, and in the Southwest and Southeast as well, two areas where there's a tremendous amount of Latino immigration, are also the voters who feel most threatened by the prospect of greater Latino immigration, who feel that the more immigrants the United States takes in, the less likely it is they'll be able to keep up their livelihoods and help their families. And so you have this other pressure of actual Republican voters feeling betrayed by Republicans who vote for any sort of comprehensive immigration reform, not because Democrats will win elections, but because they feel doing so harms their economic interest. And I think this is what drove a good deal of the backlash to President Bush's attempt at comprehensive immigration reform in 2007. Which, together is why I'm not sure that anything comprehensive is possible, and that I'm fairly certain that the best thing you'll be able to get in the near term is something piecemeal, because something, addressing highly educated immigrants is, I think, less tricky for Republicans to go after than trying to bring 11 million undocumented immigrants into the system.
Okay. I want to switch topics again because we have a lot more to talk about. I want to go into Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I like to refer to Obamacare as the Freddy Krueger of policy. It just does not die. I mean, it survived the summer of 2010 when the Tea Party went after it hard in a very organized, aggressive way. It survived the Supreme Court, and it survived this election, this past election 3 weeks ago, where it now seems that the appetite on the Hill to overturn it is not it's not there anymore. So it's the law of the land now, and it'll largely take effect in 2014. But it's not really going to be in the hands of the states. So how do these states deal with it, particularly in these states whose governors very actively opposed it, very actively, don't want it. So how do they deal with it? And I just also want to note that latest CNN poll still shows that most people, more people don't like this. It's not popular. So how do the governors in these states deal with this? Joe, I'll start with you.
I mean, look, I think most of them are going to. The first thing is going to be deciding whether they do the exchanges or they let the feds decide for them, which I think most of them will slowly come to the conclusion that it's better for them to do it their way than to let. I mean, again, if you're a Republican, that's how you want to govern anyway. So even though they're doing you had some of them doing the boycott. Well, we're not gonna do the exchange. I think in the end, almost all of them will do it themselves and set it up themselves and make it work. Again, the one great thing about the system is that a governor does have responsibility to. He's there when it's not working. That's who people blame. So I think you're going to see adoption by GOP governors, whether they may hate it, they may do it kicking and screaming, but they're going to do it.
Bob?
You see someone like John Kasich, the governor of Ohio. He's rejecting the Obamacare exchange. I think this is going to become a key litmus test for Republicans, especially if they want to have a political future on the national level. If you're thinking about running for president in 2016 and you're one of the 30 Republican governors right now, you're going to reject this exchange because there's still an appetite in the Republican Party to just push back constantly against Obamacare. Now, when you talk to leaders on Capitol Hill who are Republican, they admit that Obamacare in whole is probably not going away. Pre-existing conditions, staying on your parent insurance. Even Republicans realize that it's not politically viable or even a good idea to go against those parts of the bill, of the law. At the same time, the mandate is going to continue to be a hot political issue. You're going to have Republicans rail against it. But I think Republicans look at the fight against Obamacare, especially in the states, as the next front. And I don't think they're going to go lightly.
Kiki, what do you think?
I think Bob raised a really good point. Somebody like Governor Kasich, who this is a guy between a rock and a hard place, right? Ohio's economy is growing. You all know from the news coverage of the general election that their unemployment rate is drastically below the national average. That's a good thing for a guy who wants to run for president in 2016 and will, and I think has a probably pretty darn good chance to be the nominee, as good a chance as anyone else to be the nominee of the Republican Party. But that's a decision about Republican primary politics, not about governing politics and not running for re-election in Ohio politics. And so those will be the exceptions, I think, that Joe talked about, so that in a primary, they can stand up in a primary debate and still rally that flag around the 5% of the Republican base that participate in that process. I think I'm making a prediction that along with, a deal this winter and the long-term effects of what the Obama health care, the Affordable Care Act does, 50 years from now, people will forget that this was so unpopular, because the positive effects will be in place. And all the different constituencies that are affected by the things that Bob just pointed out will have, in fact, enjoyed those benefits and those opportunities. What changes happen to Obamacare now won't be legislative against the ACA. They'll actually be in the form of the budget. There will be tinkering at the budget level. There will be more health care savings that come as part of the budget on top of ACA. There will be entitlement reforms around Medicare that come beyond the savings in the ACA, but they're part of the budget deal. So that's where I think you'll see that. The days of big move on the House floor to repeal Obamacare, even from the silly symbolic vote on a Thursday afternoon, gone.
The one thing I'd add, though, is the stuff that you're going to have to do to get the Republican nominations be a really long list. You can't be for amnesty, pro-life. There's and now you've got to have said no to health care. Just put your, according to, it's hard. Now you're going to get the nomination. That nomination is going to be worth that and $4. That and the nomination $4 will get you Starbucks coffee by the time they're done. They really have got to take a good hard look at at where this party is going, I think, and who controls that nominating process. Or I don't think they are going to win at many national elections. If that's what you have to do to get the nomination, it's going to be very, very tough. You can get the nomination. That part will be easy. Then you got to go try to sell that all to the American people, and I don't think demographically it's just not going to work, and it gets tougher the more you have to do those kinds of things to get there.
Okay, real quick note on Joe's point. One thing to keep an eye on is the Ames straw poll. This is the unofficial circus event that happens in Ames, Iowa every 4 years, the summer before the election. And this passed in 2011. Michelle Bachmann won it, Congresswoman from Minnesota. I remember I was right with her as she won, dancing around with her husband Marcus, thinking she had won something real. And then she just collapsed a few months later in the Iowa primary, in the Iowa caucuses, Already now, Republicans are taking heed to Joe's point. Governor Terry Branstad, the governor of Iowa, who's been governor for years. He took a break. He was governor before. Now he's back. He says, let's just get rid of the Ames straw poll, because it's a shame that Iowa conservatives, who are a small percentage of even the Republican primary electorate, are deciding the nominee. Can someone like Jeb Bush, George P.'s father, win in a place like Iowa with his views on immigration, with his views on taxes? It'd be very tough. Republicans want to have some more options in 2016, and they're already looking to get away of the Ames straw poll. They may look to do some other similar things as well.
To go back to the Affordable Care Act a little, I actually think the exchanges are not the less interesting, but sort of the thing not to really watch for. It's the Medicaid expansion. In the Supreme Court's ruling, John Roberts wrote that the Obama administration could not compel states to take the Medicaid expansion. They had to choose where they wanted it. And so I think now, over the next few years, you'll see whether states want to take federal money. The Affordable Care Act, I think, matches about 90% of the cost of the Medicaid expansion to expand the programs. Initially, I think a lot will reject it. I know Nikki Haley in South Carolina has already said that she does not plan to take it. Bobby Jindal in Louisiana has said the same. But again, they face pressure from interest groups in industries within their own states. If you're a doctor, if you're a hospital, you really want your governor to take that Medicaid expansion, take that money, because it's more customers for you. If you're a senior, if you run hospice care, if you're in nursing homes, these are all interest groups within these states who would gain a tremendous amount from the federal government giving the state essentially free money to bulk up their Medicaid programs. And For Democrats, they really ought to hope that Republican governors do expand their programs, because around 17 million of the people covered by the Affordable Care Act are covered through Medicaid. And so if you have all these red states rejecting Medicaid expansions, that really blunts the potential effect of the Affordable Care Act and makes it more difficult for Democrats to sort of sell the law once it's in effect. It's harder to say, listen, we've done all this good for you, when a bunch of states have just rejected the funds and assistance necessary to actually do those things.
Right. I do have to say I find it astounding that the political climate has gotten us to a point where states are rejecting free money. I mean, who rejects free money? But okay, so I want to move on to the next issue, the next policy issue, or rather theme. And I want to talk about this because Kiki's on the panel, and because I found it fascinating, this election. I was just amazed that what this election should have been about the economy and jobs, period. I think that if it were about just the economy and jobs, that Mitt Romney probably could have won. But instead it got, and don't get me wrong, a lot of it it was a major issue, but a lot of it got sort of, bumbled up by these social issues. Let's focus on the women's issues, and let's talk about, Todd Akin and Murdoch in Indiana, who brought up, and I'm sure it wasn't planned, and it wasn't part of the overall strategy of the Republican Party or Mitt Romney's campaign.
Or a Republican governor here in Virginia.
Or a Republican governor, But it really just took up a lot of space and a lot of talk, and people were talking about it on MSNBC and Fox and CNN, and legitimate rape and contraception and women were just turned off, single women especially, who's we know that the thing they care about most is the economy, went for Obama when they were open to Mitt Romney, but they were so turned off by all of this. Given that and what happened, the last year, how do both Democrats and Republicans govern moving forward on these issues? And what's the tone going to be like? Kiki.
So I'm not always the most popular with the other women activists in my party when I say this, but this is what I believe is true. I don't believe that women voters found this campaign experience to be a war on women. And I say that because I spent most of last year being involved in a bipartisan research project with Walmart Moms. You may have seen a bunch of the coverage of that. And if not, go look at walmartmomsresearchproject.com, and you'll see focus groups that began before the primaries kicked off and went through right to a survey on election night. In 2000, it was a bipartisan. Alex Brady from POS Strategies and Margie O'Meara, a Democratic pollster, did this. And focus groups, I can't even tell you the number of focus groups I watched and sat through, all over the country and in key states. And in June, in particular, when the heat of the war on women was there, the women in those focus groups said, no, there's no war on women. We care about the economy. And so what I would say is, yes, did Akin and Murdoch's comments hurt them and lose them races? Absolutely. But was it because women disagreed with them? No. It didn't matter whether women agreed with them or disagreed with them. It's because it took focus away from where the economy was and judgment was. When people get into debates about reproductive health and contraception for women, that's about economic opportunity, and that's about economic freedom for women. And the party that understands that and talks about those issues in that way will win. They will win time and time again. What the wrong message for Democrats to take away to be that we should run all our campaigns on choice, right? These are get out the vote issues. When I speak all over the country, I frequently look up and say, is there anyone who has not made up their mind about choice or abortion? Raise your hand if you have not made up your mind. Okay, that's not a persuasion vote. That's a get out the vote. And what happened was these were errors to demonstrate that these two particular candidates didn't understand what was important. And when you're flubbing up on that, where are you going to be? Interestingly, Walmart Moms in this long-term project defined as a mom with a child under 18 in the home who shopped at Walmart in the last month. They can be married or single. The economics of that are fairly broad. The education is both non-high school, high school, and college. And what you find, and they represent about 15% of the electorate. What you find is that in 2008 they voted for Obama. They really are the swing vote. In 2010, they went back to Republicans and went with the Tea Party swinging that. And then in this election, where there was a 15 or 17 point gap, what was the final? A lot gap between women voting for Romney.
It was a smaller gap, but still big.
But it was still huge. Walmart moms actually voted right where the electorate did at 50-48. It was closer. So to a lot of women, these issues that are traditionally women's issues are about the economy, child care, health care. Those are all about their economic security in the future. And how other candidates talk about them, and particularly male candidates, demonstrates their lack of recognition about the role it plays in a woman's economic security in her future.
Okay, I'm going to go to the men on this now, but I wanted to give Kiki first shot at it. So, Bob, what do you think? How do we talk about these issues moving forward?
Well, Todd Akin in Missouri, Richard Murdoch in Indiana, do they make idiotic statements about rape? Obviously. Horrible candidates. But I think on the other side, the president ran a pretty crass campaign when it came to social issues. When he made fun of Romney's remark on binders full of women, I mean, that's such a small, trivial thing that was blown up by the Obama campaign, particularly because I think they wanted just to continue to gin up single women who are an important demographic for them.
But that's crass?
Here's what I thought was crass.
Okay.
The Life of Julia advertisement on the part of the Obama campaign, online they had this massive Rube Goldberg-type presentation of how the federal government helps women throughout their lives, and it uses phrases like you can get under President Obama, you can get married. Under President Obama, you can have a baby. You can Google different examples of how just Julia thing that I found was odd, and it was just a way. I think it was a strange way to approach the female vote. The Obama's campaign during the convention, Sandra Fluck had a major role. The president called her, got involved in the Rush Limbaugh spat. You could wonder why does the president get involved? Maybe he's trying to make a statement. But at the same time, Life of Julia, making so much of the binders, Sandra Fluck. This is a campaign, to me, the Obama campaign, that was really trying to get the single women vote. And I think they almost went a little bit too far. Did Republicans make a ton of mistakes? Yes. But at the same time, I don't think Obama deserves plaudits for how he handled the female vote.
Okay, I'm gonna. Jamelle, what do you think?
So I think it's unreasonable to expect campaigns to not be crass. They always have been. My favorite slogan is "Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion" from the 1876 campaign. I mean, sort of in 1888, you have "Ma, where's my pa?" Did Grover Cleveland have a kid out of wedlock? Yeah, and his opponents went after him. So I just don't find. Regardless of how I feel about the actual crass itself, I just see it as something to be expected in a campaign. I'm not sure how both parties govern on this going forward because I'm not necessarily sure that they have to do anything differently. I mean, obviously Republicans should not use language like legitimate rape, but other than that, they don't. The American public's pretty divided on abortion. Republicans can continue to win elections being very pro-life. I don't see that as much of a problem. What I saw in this election, though, was to back up a little. I'm not sure that this election should have been about the economy. I think American presidential elections are about a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think that in this election in particular, one thing that it was for a lot of different groups, and not just women, was about their place in sort of the American polity, the American democracy. That I think part of the reason why you saw, for instance, Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans vote so heavily against Mitt Romney was this perception that the Republican Party is putting forth a vision of America that didn't include them, and they wanted to vote against that. Likewise, for women and for single women, for young women in particular, I think they perceived, separate and apart from the policies and from the economy and everything, I think they perceived the Republican Party putting forth a vision of America that didn't include them, that didn't include their interests and their values as valuable things worth respecting. And so going forward, I think what the Republican Party needs to do is just not do that, right? Talk to single women, talk to women as voters with interests worth respecting, even if they disagree. As for the actual substance of their policies, they probably largely stay the same, because I think George W. Bush didn't have meaningfully different policies on reproductive health from Mitt Romney. The difference is that George W. Bush didn't approach women in the way that Mitt Romney or other Republicans this cycle did.
Joe, did the so-called war on women or the way some of these candidates talked about these issues affect the outcome of the race?
I don't think so. Not much. I mean, I think, look, it may have turned out a few, on turnout, on some persuasion, it may have. But, look, both campaigns, we can go with, you didn't build that, as, as soon as anybody said anything that even quasi could be turned into a mistake or used as a wedge to engage people in a different, away from the guy they were looking at. Both campaigns did as crass a job as the other one. Having not been involved in a crass campaign myself. But okay, yeah, the nose is growing. No, but I'm saying, so that part. Look, they're both campaigns, but there's been a gender gap for quite a while. Men have always tended to vote a little bit more for the Republican candidate in most instances, and women for Democrats for as long as I can remember. In presidential politics, at least that's been fundamentally true. So I don't really think that the binders full of women did a whole lot. What it did do was it drowned out anything else that we were all talking about for a week. I mean, that was the one thing I think that the Obama campaign did a really, really good job of. You mutter the word felon, and then watch the Romney campaign yap about it and call you and get upset about it for a week. And we all, in every cable channel, talks about Stephanie Cutter saying the word felony instead of whatever, the economy or anything else. It worked fine. In the end, though, it all still, as far as I'm concerned, fundamentally gets down to a real problem for the Republican Party, and that is that there is like a contempt almost for whether it's the 47% takers, the contempt on women who are single. I mean, there's a contempt for immigrants. I mean, there just is in the way their language. And I'm not talking about all Republicans, but I'm talking about an element. And so when you have somebody, one of them say, just get into rape or definition of rape and all these other things, it doesn't work. And here's the just one fact that people need to sort of think about if you're the Republican Party. In 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush got 60% of the white vote. In 1988, there were enough whites in America in the voting population that got you 400 electoral votes. In 2012, that doesn't get you 400 electoral votes. Getting 61%, by the way, does not get you 400 electoral votes. It doesn't get you 300 electoral votes. It barely gets you over 200 electoral votes. And if you're losing women in combination with African Americans, Hispanics, gays, anybody that you've sort of pushed aside, it's a real problem. I mean, there is no way to get anywhere near 270 if you continue to do that. Now, I don't know whether it's women, whether it's Hispanics, whether it's, on immigration, on all these issues that we've talked about today, they have to really rethink, I think, what the coalition that they're building their party on. Because right now they're building it on old white men. And there's a problem, guys. Old white men die. And so the younger generation, I'm sorry, I don't mean any offense to, but they, yeah, well, I'm getting there. And my point is that so young people young people are more socially tolerant than where the party is. So you've got a generational problem, a gender problem, racial problem. I mean, there are just a bunch of problems. And I'm one of these people. I think this country desperately needs two competitive, strong parties competing on ideas and getting the American people engaged. I think we're a much stronger, better country if that happens. But right now, I'm not that my party's a whole lot better on a lot of things. I like it a lot better than I like Republicans, but Republican Party right now. But the Republican Party really does have to rethink what it's about. I really believe that.
Yeah, we don't have Ed Rollins here, and so we're down one Republican on the panel. So I want to give Bob a chance to respond to that, because what Joe sort of laid out is pretty dire for the Republican Party, but is that where we are?
I think Joe brings up a lot of good points. Revolving the campaign, one quick story. When Todd Aiken happened, Mitt Romney, of course, was trying to focus on the economy and jobs, but the whole news cycle became consumed with this Aiken comment. And so I got, out of the blue, I got a private number coming into my cell phone. It's Romney. He wants to comment on Aiken. He says, I have 5 minutes. I'll talk to you about Aiken. I got to respond to this. And I think that was indicative. I got an exclusive on it, which was great. But it was indicative that Romney just felt so boxed in that as much as he wanted to make the election about A, it's going to be about B, it's going to be about C, depending on the news cycle. And I think as much as the war on women was manufactured by Democrats, the Obama campaign did a very good job after manufacturing a fake crisis that when a real crisis happened with Aiken and Murdoch, they executed as political professionals and did a good job at putting Romney in a tough position. But the second thing Joe brings up about Republicans becoming a party of old white men, I think this is something Republicans, especially the old white men on Capitol Hill, are very worried about. And a quick story about how they're addressing this. Right after the election, they have a leadership election on Capitol Hill. The first 3 slots in the House Republican Conference, Speaker John Boehner, Leader Eric Cantor, Whip Kevin McCarthy from California. They're the top 3. They stayed the top 3. The number 4 spot is conference chairman. That spot was open. Jeb Henschel, the former chairman, is now going over to become a committee chairman. In the race for conference chairman, the 4th spot, this month, you had 2 people running against each other. Tom Price, a conservative, elderly white doctor from Georgia, and Kathy McMorris Rogers, a moderate Boehner ally from Washington State. During the conference meeting when they had the speeches before the vote, one congressman from Pennsylvania told me that he was listening when Price spoke about whether he really had a Southern accent, because they're so worried if they vote in Price, as much as they like Price, the presentation would be 4 white men running the House Republican Conference. So as much as Price is very popular internally in the House, he lost the House Republican Conference race. Now you have Kathy McMorris Rogers as a woman as the number 4 House Republican. That, I think, is an important example of how the party is collapsing in redressing demographics, but at least inside of the House Republican Conference, they're very wary of this problem, and they're trying to move in a certain direction, at least for now.
Okay. With that, we have some time now for questions, so we can talk about what you want to talk about. And there's 2 microphones on either side. So if you have a question from our illustrious panel on any issue.
I have mostly a question. Am I correct in my understanding that right on the heels of the, one hopes, a solution to the fiscal crisis, the cliff, that we have yet another very, very serious thing that caused this crisis in the first place, and that's the debt limit issue. Is that not right on the heels of it?
Yep.
And what have you got to say about that? It seems to me that that's going to be a monumental battle.
I mean, I think that's what I said in the beginning. My first answer was that they're going to have a deal to have another short-term deal, and you're going to have 2 things in 2013. I predict you're going to have another deal on the fiscal cliff, on some kind of tax rate, and you're going to also have a debt limit discussion. And I'm not so sure of the remedy, but you do see right now the Gang of 8 in the Senate, for instance, a group of Republicans and Democrats are trying to come to a compromise. But both sides, McConnell, Harry Reid, they're drawing lines in the sand right now, and there are multiple things happening on fiscal crisis that just don't seem to be ready to be solved.
I do think this, by the way, this comes after the first of the year. So there's, I don't know exactly, it's 6 weeks separate or something like that, just by the fluke of the calendar, not that they're attached to one another. A couple things to think about here. Number one, those who are putting it in the sequestration negotiations, it's a tactic on negotiation, not necessarily a part of that deal, so you should understand that. Number two, I think all people involved are pretty embarrassed by what happened last year. And I think that Republican leaders are hearing from CEOs in business who say, that's the thing we can't tolerate. That's the piece we can't tolerate. Don't do that to yourselves again. And I think number three, the president has learned that, you know what? Congressional leaders for hundreds of years now have managed to pass this, and it's their business, their job, their responsibility to do it. Get out of the way and let them do it. Because then whose shoulders is it on if they don't? It's theirs.
Jamelle, do you?
I think if the debt ceiling becomes another bargaining chip, I think you might see more pressure from liberals to get rid of it. Right, the debt ceiling is not even. I mean, it was passed in 1917 as an administrative function that the Treasury, Congress wanted to make it easier to just authorize the Treasury to pay its bills, and so they're like, oh, we'll have this limit. When you press up against it, let us know, and we'll raise it. And it's sort of nothing. It's really nothing that should be used as a bargaining chip, and it sort of doesn't. When you think about it, it doesn't really make much sense. Like why would the Treasury need permission to pay bills that have already been incurred? And so if it becomes a bargaining chip, I really do think that you'll see more pressure just to get rid of it. That you'll see people on the left side of the ledger say, listen, there must be something in the Constitution that allows the president to just say this is silly and we can get rid of it and take it off the table as a thing that can be used in negotiations. In part because last year's debt ceiling standoff created a measurable hit to the economy, that consumer confidence plummeted, that job growth slowed down significantly, and having something like that on the table every year just is not a recipe for any sort of governing. And what you don't want to happen is for the debt ceiling to become a normal or routine bargaining chip, such that when there's a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, Democrats then go, oh, we're going to do this too, and just for the hell of it, subject the country to a mini recession.
We have another question over here.
Yes, thank you very much for having this. I've very much enjoyed it. My name is M.J. Abbott, and I just returned from Afghanistan about a little while ago, where I work with USAID, the Department of State, and with one of our coalition forces, New Zealand, and the military there for 2 years. So could we turn a little bit away from totally domestic politics to an international feel? The politics of international economics. Given the fireworks in Euro right now involving Europe, given the slowing growth in China, given the increased corruption via economic impact, direct investment, etc., in Russia. Could I have you all kind of address some of these issues with respect to little d or little r or big D and big R policy or moving forward on a global type economy note? Big one, I'm sorry. Is that okay?
Who wants to take this one?
All right, I'll get. The reality is we're still the strongest economy. It's relative right now, right? We're not as strong as we could be or should be, but we're still stronger than everywhere else. And in light of the fact that, as you said, China's economy is slowing, I'm not sure everybody's really aware of that yet, of how much that economy is slowing. And so the need to demonstrate what can and should be done with an economy is tremendous, besides its impact on us immediately here, but what it does to the impact around the rest of the country. And when you look at the number of global CEOs of companies that are based here and the need to get them to release capital into the markets that won't just be about our markets, but global markets in which they do business, that's the real push and the rub. And by the way, thank you for your service in AID and to be in a war zone. Thank you very much for being there.
One of the things that was interesting is how throughout this presidential campaign we heard about there was too much uncertainty. We're uncertain about taxes. We're uncertain about whether health care reform is going through. All these things that we're uncertain about, people don't want to put their money in the game because of all the uncertainty. I've always thought that that almost none of that had anything to do with the uncertainty. That most of the uncertainty that most of these people have been worried about are the ones that you're talking about. China's slowing growth, whether Europe can make it or not, These are all issues that if you're a company out there thinking about hiring, you'd like some clarity on. Even though we are the strongest economy in the world, I agree with Kiki. The problem is, I think most of them are not sure that Europe's going to make it, that the euro's going to make it, and that will have an impact on us. That could trigger another recession here. And just as somebody who's I've worked for the Prime Minister, for Tony Blair. I worked for Prodi when we Prime Minister of Italy. Andreas Papandreou. Don't blame me. That was in the 90s in Greece. I wouldn't bet on that place making it. I wouldn't bet on the euro making it. And I'm not an economist. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm talking about the political reality of how it got put together. The political apparatus is not in place. There is no president of Europe. There's no Senate and House there. And so I think it's going to have. That's the place I'd be. Things are messed up in a lot of places, and we're doing a much. We are actually. It's a slow recovery, but we're much stronger, and we are on a much better footing than any of the places that you mentioned. And any one of them could create another round of bad economic news that does impact us, and that the president and the House, the GOP, big D Democrats, big R Republicans are not going to be able to do a whole lot more than they're already doing to help those places, fix this. But Europe it's the political mess of how you can fix that. It's just the structure isn't there to do it, I don't think.
Okay, we have another question.
Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Kyle Knives. I was interested in hearing your opinions now that the dust has settled in the first full electoral cycle since Citizens United, how you would evaluate the impacts of super PACs in this last electoral cycle, both the presidential and congressional levels, and where you see that kind of trend moving in the future.
That's a really good question. Who wants to go first? Yeah. Jamelle, okay.
I think it depends on how you look at it. If you look at it simply as a return per investment matter, I think you can say that Republican super PACs at the very least had a bad year. They spent a tremendous amount of money trying to get Barack Obama out of the White House and trying to get Democrats out of the Senate or out of control of the Senate, and failed on both counts. By contrast, Democratic super PACs, while they'd raised less money and spent a little less money, had some pretty successful advertisements and moves in states like Ohio and Wisconsin, and certainly in Missouri and Indiana, where they played a part in sort of pouncing on Aiken and Murdoch, respectively, once those events happen. On the other hand, if you look at this not so much as a return on investment thing and more of a statement about what super PACs and rich donors can do, then I think they actually had a pretty successful year. I mean, from now on, if you are a presidential candidate, if you are a senatorial candidate, if you are a House candidate, you know that there are people willing to spend $100, $200 million in an election cycle to make sure that you're gone or to make sure that you fall in line with them. And that's sort of soft power. How that affects the behavior of representatives, even if you don't spend another dime that cycle, is I think very important and very much worth considering. Likewise, I think it's also important to note that we're not really sure what the election would have looked like absent that money. So it's possible, it is in fact possible that Mitt Romney's vote share is higher than it would have been absent super PACs, and the same goes for the Republican Party's vote share writ large. And so I think on the balance, if I were running a super PAC, I would not, obviously in my direct political goals, and if I were Republican, I would see this as not a big success. But if I were looking more strategically over the long term, I would see this as a good first step towards building a political environment where everyone is sort of aware of the power I wield.
Real quick, I see this from two perspectives. If you're a conservative or Republican, you're both happy and sad with super PACs this cycle. You're sad in the fact that Karl Rove, American Crossroads, and many other Republican-leaning super PACs failed They didn't do well to support Mitt Romney. They had made a lot of strategic mistakes. But from a constitutional standpoint, if you're conservative, this was a pretty good year. Citizens United enables campaign spending in a lot of ways to be considered speech. And so if you believe that campaign spending is speech and protected under the First Amendment, you're able to do it much more freely this cycle than you were in previous years. And so a lot of Republicans are happy about that fact, even though on the nuts and bolts, they didn't do so well.
I'd say that there's a couple of things. First of all, as a practitioner, it's very tough for an independent expenditure or a super PAC, anybody on the outside of the campaign, to do positive stuff for the campaign. There's a couple reasons. You can't put the candidate to camera saying, looking sincere and saying what he wants to do. That would be coordination. So generally, when you start a super PAC like that, going in, your job is to be the bad guy. And that the candidate and his campaign, their job, they may have to do some of the negative stuff too, but that their job is to present the positive. And I think tactically, we can get into errors and who said what and that kind of stuff, but tactically, the Obama campaign spent most of the summer really defining Romney, and there's nothing I don't think any of the super PACs could have done to help him. He had to do that. They had to Stuart Stevens and his campaign had to make the judgment that they were going to enter the fray and define him positively. They didn't do it. They didn't have a chance to do that in the primaries because of the tough primary. That wasn't their fault. I don't know about the money situation. Maybe that's the reason, but they didn't do it, and I don't believe the super PACs could do it, not effectively. And so I'd say, look, I think I'd be on the side of the super PACs probably kept Romney closer, or he did better than he would have done left to his own devices. I think for democracy, the downside is that if you're running for president of the United States in either party right now, you're seriously speed dating billionaires, because that's a lot easier than building a grassroots, 9-10 million people who are going to give you $10, which the Republicans still haven't really effectively done. And so that's the downside of that. But if you look at the ramifications of that, of what I just said, look for a lot more money, doing a lot more negative ads. I mean, that's one of the reasons we had more negative ads this time. Again, I'm talking about even before the advent of super PACs, and I think Kiki would agree with this. In a campaign, the independent expenditure people almost always confine themselves to negative advertising. It's just, we don't know what the campaign's going to do. We're going to assume the campaign's going to tell its story positively or do whatever positive stuff it has to do. Our job is to throw hurdles in front of the other guy. And so once you get that kind of money in super PACs, and that's the mindset, and there's real reasons for it, having to do with you don't have a candidate and other things, we're probably looking at a lot more money and a lot more negative, and candidates who are busy right now trying to figure out which billionaire they can finesse into going off and being on their side next time around.
We have time for one last question, and that's you.
Hi, thank you all for coming here today to talk to us. My name is Tonya Maestros. I'm a student at the university here, and I'm in a campaigns and elections course, and we've been talking about image making, and I was wondering, based off of this recent election and the issues that you think are central, what do you think is the future image that candidates and parties should be trying to make?
Kiki?
We have to give away the whole secret, right? This goes back to the first part of the discussion we had, which is the American people are looking for problem solvers now. The challenges are untenable to most families in this country right now. And that is regardless of whether or not the debate is about government being large or small. This is about creating solutions and solving problems. I helped found an organization called No Labels, which is a group of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents who are working to push back against hyperpartisanship and move and create a space for problem solving. And I think we've got a culture that rewards obstructionist behavior. You call and complain only. You don't call and say, stay at the table and negotiate it out. Get out. Don't you leave the table until you got a deal. I expect you to stay there, as opposed to don't you dare go to that table or we'll primary you and we'll take you out. And that's the turn I think that the country is slowly making. But I want to make sure that we talk for just a second about the role of leadership, and particularly when it comes to image making. And leadership, you can be a college professor, you can run a business office, which I run with clients, you can be a campaign manager and strategist, as Joe has been. The bottom line is people want to have someone with confidence that they can believe in, right? So if you're running for president, or if you're my president, I want you to come out and tell me what it is we need to do. I'll give you my feedback, whether, okay, that feels right to me. I don't know what to do. I'm looking to you to come tell you where I start. The worst thing you can do in a client relationship, for those of you here who have clients or have had them in your career, is to walk into a room and say, I'm not really sure what we should do. That's death, right? Leadership is to come in and say, this is what I think we should do. I can't guarantee you it'll work. Here are the risks, I think, but this is where we should move forward. And I think when it comes to image making, and particularly around presidential elections, and particularly around the concept of where we're asking a country to go forward, leadership, you can't cheat on that category.
Bob?
I think the image question is a really interesting one. I've thought about it a lot. Covering politics, I've only been covering politics 3 years, but I really get the sense that whenever you cover Senate races, House races, presidential campaigns, it really is becoming too much about the image. If someone doesn't have a certain look, or they're not able to talk in a cultural way, or they're not hip, then they're suddenly just cast out. The newspapers won't cover them in a serious way, or they'll get mocked. And look, I like having fun with politics as much as anyone, but I think there is an image, too much emphasis on image everywhere in politics. It's trivialized politics in many ways, but at the same time, it's really started maybe in 1960 with the Kennedy-Nixon debates. But right now in this 24/7 media culture, if you don't have a certain image and you can't connect on a hip level, then you're not going to really succeed in politics. And that's why you see so many Republicans and Democrats just saying no thanks to running for national office, because they cannot compete in that image area.
I'd say that we've run through radio, where what mattered was, did you have the voice of God or not, to, oh, wait a minute, the guy with the voice of God sweats profusely and doesn't shave. But I like that charismatic young guy, John F. Kennedy, because he looks really young and vibrant. And so what looks like mattered more than what it sounded like. And now we're entering, and there was a phoniness to that, because anybody can fake it for 30 seconds, and guys like me can help figure out how to do that. And I think now we're entering the authentic is this 24/7 cable, everything coming, running, news cycles that are minutes long, not hours long, is demanding authenticity. If you can't fake it, no one can fake it in this environment. They can't fake it 24/7. There's somebody out there who's going to catch you on camera saying something, and at fundraisers, and they do now. And so the campaigns have sort of tried to deal with it in two ways. The one is, and the more common way right now, is to lock everything up. Do not show this guy, anywhere near as often. We just don't put him out in press conferences. We don't put him in that situation. Hide him. Everything's very controlled, because God knows if they ever discover who's really behind that, they'll never vote for him. And I think it's a really dangerous time for a politician, because the electorate hasn't even understood yet that that's what's going on. So, like, I remember a senator I think it was the 2008 cycle, I can't remember, fell asleep in a hearing at like 2 a.m. I think it was Conrad Burke. I can't remember who it was, but somebody fell asleep in a hearing. And it went over the internet really fast and went crazy. And all of a sudden the guy's in big trouble because he fell asleep on the job, and that's well, that's an authentic moment. The third guy is not going to get thrown out because he fell. I mean, first of all, there is no U.S. senator in history who hasn't fallen asleep in one of those hearings. But it takes us time to realize, wait, that's an authentic moment, and we're not going to throw a guy out because of that. So I think there's a danger zone, but I think we are moving to, and that, by the way, I think is why Chris Christie is doing as well as he does.
Yeah.
Because people realize whether you like him or not, whether you agree with his policies or not, you think or believe you're seeing a real authentic person who's telling you what he really thinks. Now, some people are going to be able to act that out. I don't, but I think they'll get caught. But I do think authenticity and being real is going to be where we're going, and I think that was one of Romney's problems. I saw a picture of him on Thanksgiving Day with Ann that was circulating the last few days. I was like, where the hell was that guy during the campaign? They never showed him that way. It was a very real, authentic view of him that I had never seen before.
I want to add, from a strategic point of view, when you're in a campaign and you're sitting around a table somewhere at midnight trying to make a decision about what these two guys are going to see the next day on the trail, what Joe raises is a strategic question, and that's about access. Do you run this sort of candidate in a box, hide them and hide their flaws from the public, or do you lean into it? There's an argument for leaning into it, and I'll give you a story from 1992 with Bill Clinton, he's authentic. You get them all, right? There's nothing held back. But John King, who you see on CNN now, at the time was the Young Star AP reporter, who caught on to Clinton very, very early in his career. And John I was Governor Clinton's communications director at the Democratic Leadership Council, right? He kind of got the idea, got ready to run, I guess is the way we say it. And there were a few reporters who saw him very early on and paid attention very early on and spent time there with him. And one of the things John said is in the earliest days of the campaign, there were 3 reporters who traveled on that plane. One was Mark Halperin. He was a young producer at ABC at the time. One was John King, and another was Adam Nagurney, who's now the LA Times bureau chief for the LA bureau chief for the New York Times. And one of the things John said was having so much access to the candidate early on meant I understood who he was. This goes back to the negotiations. So that Bill Clinton's not a morning person. So that as a reporter, when I saw him give a speech at 9 a.m. in the morning and he just wasn't as enthusiastic and vibrant as he normally is, I didn't think that meant he lacked enthusiasm for the policy or the idea he was speaking about. I just knew the guy sucks in the morning, he's just not good. And so there is an argument to be made if you want to do better and you really want to address the flaws from a strategic point, don't hold them back. Push them out there. Drive familiarity so that people really understand. And to Joe's point on Romney, when the story came out that there had been a turn, that the candidate's family had come in and said to Stuart Stevens and the rest of them, you get out of the way. We want our dad to be our dad. Now, you never know what the real story is, but there's usually a seed of truth that something along those lines happened. You will notice that Mitt Romney did not make gaffes after that. All spring and summer, he campaigned as this ultra-conservative through the primaries to survive it on an agenda that was not consistent with his historic agenda, and he tripped, and he mumbled, and he bit his tongue, and he stumbled. The last few weeks of that campaign, from that first debate forward, maybe save one with the binders in the second debate, when he was set free a little bit at the risk of sounding histrionic, he did not make the daily stumbles that he'd made before. So strategically, the answer to how you deal with that, to Joe's challenges, you lean into it. You don't pull back from it, is the lesson.
Romney struggled so much. Covering him was really interesting.
Yeah.
He would never do a Bill Clinton mixing with John King and Mark Halperin at 9 o'clock at night. Romney would always retire with Ann to the hotel room. Never mingled with his aides, never mingled with reporters, intensely private. Did not like that aspect of politics. I remember one time I went to his house in Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire, and he had all these reporters there, and he was trying to make everyone feel welcome. And you walk into Mitt Romney's living room, and there's this huge cabinet, it's like a closet, and he opens it up, and he's sipping seltzer water, and it's full of every kind of booze and alcohol you can imagine. He's like, what do you guys want? And it was just odd, because we all said we'll have water because we don't want to be drinking Mitt Romney. But he tries so hard in a way to accommodate people, to be kind. He's a decent fellow, but he never had that Clinton touch, which is important now in modern politics.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to end it there because we are over. But I want to thank the panel and I want to thank all the audience for you coming out, and we hope we were interesting and gave you something to talk about.